84 American soldiers walked out of those trucks with their hands up. That's not a metaphor. That's not a number from a declassified summary. 84 men, rifles on the ground, helmets off, standing in a field outside Malmedy, Belgium on December 17, 1944, in the kind of cold that gets into your bones and doesn't leave. Some of them were still bleeding. Some of them were holding their hands so high their shoulders were shaking. And every single one of them had done exactly what the laws of war said they were supposed to do. They surrendered. And Joachim Peiper looked at them and gave an order that had nothing to do with the laws of war. What happened in that field in the next 6 minutes has been called a massacre. That word doesn't carry the full weight of it. A massacre implies chaos, implies a loss of control. What happened at the Baugnez crossroads was not chaotic. It was cold. It was methodical. It was the product of an SS command structure that had been giving the same kind of order for 3 years on the Eastern Front, and on December 17, 1944, brought that habit west. Now, here's the thing. When American investigators finally got into those files, and I mean got into them, not skimmed them, got into the original German-language orders and the after-action reports and the testimony of the men who were standing in those fields, what they found wasn't just a massacre, it was a pattern. And Patton, when he was handed the first summary in early 1945, went very still in a way that the men around him had learned to fear. Not the loud Patton, not the slapping and shouting Patton. The quiet one, the one where his jaw locked and he didn't move for a while. That one. Subscribe if you believe what happened at Malmedy should never get buried. Subscribe if you believe those 84 men deserve to have their names spoken out loud by someone who isn't reading them off a plaque in a field nobody visits. Hit like so this reaches the people who need to know it. If someone in your family served with the 285th Field Artillery Observation Battalion, drop their name in the comments right now. Let's say it out loud. Let me back up for a second and put you in December of 1944, because the context matters and most people skip it. Operation Autumn Mist, what history books call the Battle of the Bulge, launched on December 16, 1944, at 5:30 in the morning. It was the last major German offensive on the Western Front, and it was designed to punch through Allied lines, capture the port of Antwerp, and split the Allied forces in half. Hitler's thinking was that if he could inflict a big enough defeat on the Americans and British, he might force a negotiated peace on the Western Front and free up troops for the East. The offensive was massive. 25 divisions, roughly 250,000 men, pushing into the Ardennes, which the Americans had judged, incorrectly, to be a quiet sector. Joachim Peiper was given Kampfgruppe Peiper, the spearhead force. Battle Group Peiper, 1st SS Panzer Division Leibstandarte, one of the most decorated, most feared, most indoctrinated formations in the entire German military. Peiper himself had served on the Eastern Front since 1941. He had been on Himmler's personal staff. He was 30 years old in December of 1944, and he wore his Knight's Cross with oak leaves like most men wear a watch. Automatic, unremarkable. He had earned it doing things on the Eastern Front that, when they came out at trial, made courtrooms go quiet. Here's the part that didn't make it into the official report on the first day. Before Kampfgruppe Peiper moved west, Peiper received specific verbal orders, not written, verbal, about the treatment of prisoners of war. Multiple witnesses at the Malmedy trial testified to this. The orders, as reconstructed from testimony, were essentially this: do not let prisoners of war slow the advance. Read that once more. Do not let prisoners slow the advance. What that meant in practice, Peiper's men already knew from 3 years in Russia. They had been doing it for 3 years. The 285th Field Artillery Observation Battalion was a support unit. not an assault formation, not armor, not infantry. They were a technical unit, the kind that spots for artillery, calculates firing solutions, works with maps and radios and theodolites. They were driving south from Malmedy toward the town of Ligneville on the afternoon of December 17th, when they ran straight into Kampfgruppe Peiper moving in the opposite direction. The collision was instant. There was a brief exchange of fire, then it was over. The Americans, outgunned and outnumbered by an armored column that shouldn't have been anywhere near that road at that time, did the only thing that made sense. They stopped. They got out. They put their hands up. Stay with me, because what happened in that field in the next 10 minutes is the whole reason we're here, and the full weight of it takes a minute to assemble properly. The Americans were disarmed. They were herded into a field on the east side of the Baugnez crossroads, roughly 200 meters off the road. There were approximately 113 prisoners total, the surviving men of the 285th, plus some soldiers from other units picked up along the same stretch of road. Some of them were wounded, some of them were sitting, some of them were standing with their hands still raised, because nobody had told them to put them down yet. Now look, what happened next has been reconstructed from the testimony of the men who survived it. There were survivors. Not many. 43 men ultimately survived the Malmedy massacre, and every single one of them carried what they saw in that field for the rest of their lives. Their testimony, given to investigators, given at the Malmedy trial, given in letters and interviews for the next 40 years, is consistent in a way that testimony from traumatic events often isn't. Too consistent to dismiss. What's hard to swallow is how deliberate it was. The shooting started from vehicles. SS men on armored half-tracks opened fire into the group of prisoners with pistols. Then it continued on foot. SS soldiers moving through the field, among the men who were down, finishing anyone who was moving. The whole thing lasted, by multiple witness accounts, somewhere between 6 and 12 minutes. When it was over, Kampfgruppe Peiper moved on. The column didn't stop. It didn't pause for long. It had a schedule to keep. And like the 84 who didn't walk out of that field, there were bodies in the snow at the Baugnez crossroads that wouldn't be found for days. Here's where it gets ugly in a different way. The survivors who escaped, men who played dead, men who ran for the tree line while rounds were still going in, men who crawled through the snow for hours before they reached American lines. Those men reported what had happened within hours. The information went up the chain. It reached SHAEF. It reached the War Crimes Branch of the Judge Advocate General section. And it was documented, photographed, and investigated before the snow had fully melted. But here's what they don't put in the textbooks about the Malmedy investigation. When American investigators reached the Baugnez crossroads in January 1945, after the area was retaken from German forces, they found that the scene had been disturbed. Some of the bodies had been moved. Not all of them, but enough. The official investigation noted signs of deliberate repositioning of remains, a detail that suggested someone, at some point between December 17th and January, had tried to alter the evidentiary picture. The question of who, and on whose order, was never fully answered. But the investigators wrote it down, and the paper survived. Put yourself in that room for a second. You are Colonel Burton Ellis of the War Crimes Branch, and you are looking at photographs taken in January of 1945, and you are looking at a field that was a crime scene and is now partially altered, and you are trying to build a case that will hold up in a military tribunal against one of the most decorated SS officers still breathing. What Ellis did, and this is documented, this is in the trial record, was build the case anyway. Survivor testimony, physical evidence from the field, German after-action reports captured when Allied forces overran German positions, medical examiner findings, the testimony of Belgian civilians who had watched from farmhouses and had been too terrified to do anything but watch. Ellis built it piece by piece across 6 months. And all of this leads back to where Patton fits into this story, and that's a more complicated picture than most people realize. Patton didn't discover Malmedy the way he discovered Ohrdruf or Buchenwald. He didn't walk into a field and see it with his own eyes. What he had was paper, and Patton with paper and a quiet face was in some ways more dangerous than Patton with a writing crop and a raised voice. His people were in those fields, his army soldiers, men who had followed his orders, fought under his command, surrendered legally, and been murdered for it. When the summary landed on his desk, the officers in the room said he read it twice. Didn't say anything for a while. Then said that every man in Kampfgruppe Peiper needed to answer for it. Every man. Bear with me, because this is where the story picks up a dimension that most accounts leave out. Wacom Peiper was captured in May of 1945, not by Patton's people directly. By that point, the war in Europe was over, and the machinery of military justice was taking over. But the case against Peiper and the men of Kampfgruppe Peiper, 73 SS defendants total, was the largest war crimes trial in American military history up to that point. The Malmedy trial. Dachau, May 1946. Presided over by Brigadier General Josiah Dalton. Prosecuted by Ellis. 73 defendants. 43 survivor witnesses. Now, jump ahead to the trial. This is where the story turns in a direction that, I'll be honest, makes me want to put this down and walk around for a minute, because what happened during and after the Malmedy trial is one of the more sickening things in American post-war legal history, and it's almost entirely absent from the popular telling. 43 of the 73 defendants were sentenced to death. 22 were sentenced to life imprisonment. 8 received shorter sentences. The verdicts were confirmed by the theater commander. And then the appeal started. And then Senator Joseph McCarthy got involved. And then a U.S. Senate subcommittee started investigating allegations that American investigators had obtained confessions through coercion, through fake trials, through mock hangings, through beatings. The subcommittee was chaired by Senator Raymond Baldwin of Connecticut. The Baldwin Committee hearings ran into 1949. Here's what the hearings found, and here's where you need to stay with the timeline because the details matter. The committee found that some interrogation practices in the preparation of the Malmedy case had been improper. Specifically, mock trials in which defendants were led to believe they had already been convicted and would be immediately executed were used to extract confessions. Some defendants alleged beatings. The Army's own internal investigation, conducted by Judge Gordon Simpson and Judge Edward Van Roten, found enough credible allegations that the convictions were worth reviewing. Let that sit with you, because here is what this means in practice. The 43 death sentences were reviewed, then reduced, then reviewed again. By 1951, not a single one of the Malmedy defendants remained on death row. Every sentence had been commuted or reduced. Joachim Peiper, originally sentenced to death, had his sentence commuted to life. He served 11 years. He was released from Landsberg prison in December of 1956. 11 years. For 84 men shot in a field with their hands up. Now, here's where I need to give you the individual weight of this, because numbers are easy to hear and hard to feel. Private First Class Samuel Dobbins, 19 years old, from Roanoke, Virginia, attached to the 285th Field Artillery Observation Battalion. He had been in Europe for 4 months when Kampfgruppe Peiper hit his convoy on December 17, 1944. He had written home to his mother 11 days earlier. The letter, which his mother kept in a box she never threw away, and which his family made available to researchers in the 1990s, talked about the cold, talked about how he was hoping to be home by spring, talked about a girl named Helen back in Roanoke. He was one of the 84 who did not walk out of that field. And like him, there were 83 others, some of them barely older than boys, some of them with faces their families wouldn't see again except in photographs. Some of them were found by investigators in January 1945, the snow around them stained dark. Their dog tags were recorded. Their names went into a file. The file survived. The name survived. That's not a typo. 84. Read that number again in your head. If that turned your stomach, you're not ready for what the post-war record shows about Peiper's later years, because it doesn't end at Landsberg. After his release in 1956, Joachim Peiper eventually settled in Travers, France in the early 1970s, working as a translator. His neighbors knew who he was. French resistance veterans knew where he was living. On the night of July 13, 1976, his house in Travers was set on fire. His body was found in the ruins the following morning. He was 61 years old. No one was ever charged. French investigators formally closed the case. The file sits in an archive in Paris, and the case is listed as unsolved. You're in too deep to walk away now. What makes the Malmedy case different from other documented SS war crimes, and the thing that Ellis and his investigators kept coming back to, the thing that appears again and again in the trial transcripts, is the premeditation. This wasn't a snap decision made under fire. The evidence strongly suggests that the order not to burn the advance with prisoners existed before Kampfgruppe Peiper ever crossed the Belgian border. It existed in the culture of Leibstandarte SS. It existed in the 3-year Eastern Front history of this formation, where similar incidents, Peiper's own unit had been implicated in the killing of civilians and prisoners in the Soviet Union as early as 1941, had gone without consequence inside the German military justice system, because there was no German military justice system interested in SS conduct toward enemy prisoners. And what nobody knew at the time was this. The Malmedy massacre was not the only incident involving Kampfgruppe Peiper in those first days of the Ardennes offensive. As the column moved west, there were at least 6 additional documented sites where American and Belgian civilians were killed. The town of Stavelot, the village of Parfondry, the hamlet of Stur. Collectively, the incidents attributed to Kampfgruppe Peiper during its 5-day advance killed approximately 350 civilians and soldiers. Malmedy was the largest single incident. It was not the only one. Ellis knew this when he walked into that courtroom at Dachau in May 1946. He put all of it on the table. See, what most folks don't realize is that the Malmedy trial was never just about December 17th. It was about a command culture. It was about the argument, made explicitly on the record by defense counsel, that Peiper's men had acted within the parameters of their orders and their training, and that the responsibility, therefore, lay not with the men in the field, but with the command structure above them. That argument didn't fly at Nuremberg, and it didn't fly at Dachau. The tribunal found that the defendants knew the difference between a lawful order and an unlawful one, and executed the unlawful one anyway. The difference between lawful and unlawful. 84 men standing in a field with their hands up. That's the difference right there. Fast forward to 1948. The appeal process is in full motion. The confirmed death sentences are under review. And here is the detail that shows up in the War Crimes Commission records and doesn't make it into the popular histories. During the review period, several of the original survivor witnesses were re-interviewed. Not all of them were available. 2 had died in the years since the trial. 3 could not be located. Of the 38 survivor witnesses who testified at Dachau in 1946, 11 were re-interviewed in 1948, and their testimony remained consistent with their original statements in every material respect. The coercion allegations that drove the appeals, The mock trials, the alleged beatings, applied exclusively to the German defendants, not to the American and Belgian survivor witnesses. The survivor testimony was never successfully challenged. Think about that for a second. The foundation of the convictions, the testimony of men who had been in that field and survived it, held. It held through 3 years of appeals, through a Senate subcommittee, through Army review boards, through everything that was thrown at it. Because those men knew what they had seen. You don't confuse that. You don't forget it. You don't revise it for a review board in 1948. I'll tell you what. The thing that lands hardest when you read the full trial transcript, and I mean the full thing, not the summary, the actual transcript, is a specific exchange during the examination of one of the survivor witnesses, a sergeant named Kenneth Ahrens from St. Louis, Missouri. Ahrens was one of the men who survived by playing dead in that field for hours. He testified about what he heard after the shooting stopped. He testified about sounds from the field, sounds he described in a way that he clearly had spent 3 years trying to find words for, and still hadn't quite found them. The tribunal went very quiet during that testimony. The transcript notes that the courtroom was silent for approximately 30 seconds after Ahrens finished. Then the defense counsel asked his first cross-examination question, and it was about something procedural, and somehow that procedural question, after 30 seconds of silence, is one of the most revealing things in the whole document. And just when you think you've got the full picture, this turned up in a 1947 file that not many people have looked at. A memorandum from the War Crimes Branch noting that at least one SS officer from Kampfgruppe Peiper, who had participated in the events at Baugnez, had already been processed and released before his connection to the massacre was identified. He was never reapprehended. His name appears in the memo with a rank and a unit designation, and a note saying his current whereabouts were unknown. The memo is signed. The signature is legible. And the man was never tried. I'm not making this up. True story, documented. And I mean documented. The chain of 50 American dog tags that opens the most common retelling of Malmedy, the single chain, the single SS soldier, the trophy from the field. That story circulated through the Third Army in early 1945 in the weeks after the Bulge was contained. Whether it is literally true, documented as a physical artifact, is something historians still debate. What is not debated is the culture it described. The culture of the trophy. The culture of the Eastern Front brought west. Peiper's men have been doing this for years. They had absorbed it so completely that it wasn't even remarkable to them by December of 1944. That is possibly the most sickening part. That it wasn't remarkable. That they moved the column on and didn't look back. Patton looked back. He was still looking back in the spring of 1945, in letters and diary entries that are sharp and specific and angry in a way that his public voice rarely was. He wrote about Malmedy by name. He wrote about the debt that was owed. He wrote about the difference between an army that followed the laws of war and an army that didn't, and what that difference required in response. His jaw didn't unlock on the subject for months. Some who served with him in that period said they never fully saw it unlock. Here's what they found when it was all accounted for. 84 names. 84 American soldiers who had done the right thing, who had surrendered legally, who had stood in a field in Belgium with their hands up in December 1944, and who were murdered for it by men who wore their unit's insignia like a mark of pride. Those names are in the memorial at Henri Chapelle American Cemetery, not far from where it happened. They're on the wall. They're specific. They're real. Samuel Dobbins is on that wall. He was 19. He was from Roanoke. He was hoping to be home by spring. Helen was still in Roanoke when the War Department letter arrived. His mother put it in a drawer she never fully opened again. And the name she had written on the envelope of 11 letters she'd sent him between August and December of 1944, letters that came back to her marked undeliverable after January. That name is cut into stone in Belgium, in a cemetery that the snow covers every winter. 84 of them. Like him, 83 others. I know what you just heard isn't easy to sit with. It's not supposed to be. Hit like so this reaches the people who need to know it. Subscribe if you believe what they did should never get buried again, because there are names on that wall that most people alive today have never heard, and this story is still the clearest argument anyone ever made for why the laws of war exist, and what it costs when they're ignored. If someone in your family served at the Bulge, with the 285th, with the 1st Army, drop their name in the comments. Say it right here. Say it out loud where people can read it. There are stories that don't fit in one video, and this one barely did. The next one I'm telling involves something Patton found in a German officer's house in Merkers in April of 1945 that he refused to put in his official report. The item itself was small. What it represented was not. That one is coming.